The big clock on the wall ticked away the seconds, each one feeling longer than the last for the little girl. She sat at the very back of the music room, trying to make herself as small as possible. Her chair was hard, and the room always smelled faintly of old wood and lemon polish. But the thing that took up the most space, both in the room and in her mind, was the piano. It wasn't a friendly piano. To her, it looked like a giant, sleeping animal made of shiny black wood, its teeth a neat row of white and black keys. The other kids in her class at Oakwood Academy didn't seem to be afraid of it. They chattered and laughed, their fingers dancing over the tables, pretending to play. But for her, the piano was a symbol of everything that felt wrong. You see, she didn't belong here. Oakwood Academy was a school for children from families with big houses and new cars. Her family didn't have those things. Her father drove a bus, and her mother worked in a small bakery. They had scraped and saved and applied for a special scholarship, a word she heard her parents whisper with both hope and worry. That scholarship was the reason she was here. In this grand school with its huge windows and echoing hallways, most of the time she felt like she was wearing a costume, pretending to fit in. And the person who made her feel the most out of place was her music teacher, Mrs. Abernathy. Mrs. Abernathy was a woman who believed that everything had one right way. And her way was it. Her gray hair was pulled back into a tight bun that never had a single hair out of place. She stood very straight, and when she walked, her heels made a sharp, clicking sound on the floor that told everyone she was coming. Her eyes, behind her thin glasses, were very good at finding mistakes. The little girl knew Mrs. Abernathy didn't like her. She could feel it. During lessons, when each student had to play a simple scale, her turn was always the worst. Her hands would feel cold and clumsy. She could feel the teacher's stare on the back of her neck, and she would mix up the notes, her fingers slipping and hitting the keys at once, making a horrible, jangling sound. Again, Mrs. Abernathy would say, her voice flat and unimpressed. From the beginning, and try to listen this time. The other kids would fidget, waiting for their turn to be over. She would feel her cheeks grow hot with shame. She wanted to explain that it was different when she played for herself, but the words never came. She was a quiet child by nature, and the pressure of this school and this teacher made her even quieter. One afternoon, Mrs. Abernathy made an announcement. The annual parent-teacher recital is in 1 month, she said, a tight smile on her face. It is a very important event. It shows the community the quality of students we have at Oakwood. Every one of you will perform a piece. A buzz of excitement went through the room. The little girl's heart sank. A recital, in front of all the parents? The idea made her stomach feel like it was full of fluttering birds. Mrs. Abernathy started assigning pieces. For most of the children, she gave simple, happy tunes, songs everyone knew, songs that were easy to play. The little girl listened, hoping with all her heart that she would get something very, very easy, maybe just 5 or 6 notes. Finally, the teacher's eyes landed on her. You, Mrs. Abernathy said, and the room went quiet. For the recital, you will be playing for Elise. The little girl felt the air leave her lungs. She knew that piece. She had heard one of the older, advanced students practicing it once. It was beautiful, but it was long and complicated with fast parts and sad parts. It was not for a beginner. One of the boys next to her gasped softly. But that's a hard one, he whispered, a little too loudly. Mrs. Abernathy heard him. She looked at the little girl, and there was no kindness in her eyes. A challenge is good for us, she said. Though it didn't sound like she meant it was good for the girl. It sounded like a punishment. It separates those who are serious from those who are not. The sheet music is on the piano. I expect you to practice every day. The lesson ended, and the other children filed out, chatting about their own songs. The little girl stayed in her seat, frozen. She felt a hot prickling behind her eyes, but she refused to cry. Crying would only give the teacher more reason to look down on her. She finally stood up and walked slowly to the giant piano. There, on the music stand, was the sheet music for Elise. The page was a mess of little black dots and lines that swam in front of her eyes. She could never make sense of all those symbols. They were like a secret code she hadn't been taught, a language everyone else seemed to understand. She reached out a single finger and pressed down on a middle C. The note hung in the quiet, empty room, pure and clear. She knew that sound. She loved that sound. But she didn't know how to find all the other sounds the paper was asking for. As she stood there, lost and afraid, Mrs. Abernathy walked past the door. She saw the girl standing helplessly before the sheet music, and a small, cold feeling of satisfaction settled in her chest. Her plan was set. The girl would struggle, she would fail, and everyone at the recital would see it. It would be a clear, quiet message to the girl's parents. Your daughter does not have the talent or the discipline for A school like this. The embarrassment would be a sharp, necessary lesson. The little girl, unaware of the teacher's cruel thoughts, only felt the heavy weight of expectation. She looked at the piano, no longer a sleeping animal, but a monster waiting to devour her in front of a whole audience. She didn't know how she would ever get through the next month. The weight of the assignment felt like a physical thing. A heavy stone sitting in the little girl's stomach all through the rest of the school day. When the final bell rang, its cheerful ring sounded like a mockery. The other children burst out of their classrooms like a flock of freed birds, their backpacks bouncing, their voices loud with plans for games and snacks and television. She walked alone, her steps slow and dragging. The bright, sunny afternoon did nothing to lift her spirits. Instead of feeling the warmth on her skin, she only felt the cold dread of the piano waiting for her. She didn't go straight to the library to practice as Mrs. Abernathy had ordered. First, she needed to go home. Home was a small apartment in a building where the paint was a little faded, and the front garden was a little wild. It was nothing like the big, neat houses where most of her classmates lived. But as she pushed the door open, the smell of something warm and buttery from the bakery where her mother worked wrapped around her. Like a hug, her mother was already home, wiping flour from her hands with a tired but warm smile. "How was school, my little star?" her mother asked. The little girl wanted to tell her. She wanted to pour out the whole story about the recital and the impossible piece, and the way Mrs. Abernathy's eyes had looked at her. But she saw the tired lines on her mother's face, the way she leaned slightly against the counter. Her parents worked so hard day and night to keep her in that school. They believed it was her ticket to a better life. How could she tell them it felt like a prison? How could she complain about a piano lesson when they spent all day on their feet? So, she just gave a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was okay, she mumbled, and went to put her bag away. Later, she told her mother she had to go back to school for extra practice. It wasn't a complete lie, but it felt like one. Her mother's face lit up with pride. "See such dedication. Your father and I are so proud of you." Those words of praise felt like sharp little pins, pricking at her conscience. The walk back to the school felt long and lonely. The big, empty building was quiet now, the halls dark and echoing. The only sound was the soft thump of her own shoes on the polished floor. She went to the library, not the main music room. Mrs. Abernathy had given her special permission to use the old, forgotten piano there. It wasn't a grand, shiny monster like the one in the music room. This one was smaller, its brown wood scuffed and scratched, and one of its legs was slightly chipped. A few of the keys were a dull yellow, and when you pressed them, they made a slightly different sound than the others. She put her backpack down and laid the sheet music for Elise on the stand. The paper was crisp and new, a stark contrast to the old piano. She stared at the first line of notes. They were a confusing puzzle. The little dot sat on lines and in spaces, and she had to slowly count the lines every time to figure out which note it was supposed to be. "Every good boy is fine," she whispered to herself, trying to remember the teacher's lessons. But her mind went blank with panic. She placed her trembling right hand on the keys and tried to play the first few notes. It was slow and broken. She hit a wrong key, and the sound was jarring. She tried again, her fingers feeling thick and stupid. The beautiful, flowing melody she had heard in her head came out as a series of clumsy, disconnected sounds. She tried to add her left hand, and it all fell apart into a mess of clashing notes. A wave of frustration and hopelessness washed over her. Her eyes stung with hot tears. She slammed her small hands down on the keys in a sudden burst of anger, creating a loud, ugly crash that echoed in the silent library. Immediately, she flinched, looking around, afraid someone had heard her. But there was no one. Just then, she heard the familiar, sharp click-click of heels coming down the hallway. Her blood ran cold. It was Mrs. Abernathy. The little girl quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and sat up straight, pretending to be studying the music. The library door opened, and the teacher stood there, her figure framed in the doorway. She didn't come in. She just stood and listened for a moment. The little girl, her heart pounding, tried to play the first few correct notes again, her performance even shakier under the teacher's gaze. Mrs. Abernathy said nothing for what felt like a very long time. Then a small, almost invisible smile touched her lips. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone whose prediction was coming true. "I expect to hear improvement by next week," she said, her voice cool and flat. Then she turned and walked away, her heels clicking back down the hall. The sound slowly fading away. The little girl was left alone again, the weight on her shoulders even heavier than before. She felt completely and utterly defeated. The teacher had heard her failure and was satisfied by it. The month ahead stretched out in front of her like a dark tunnel with no light at the end. She put her head in her hands, the silence of the library pressing in on her. She didn't know how she was going to survive this. As the walk home from the library that day felt longer and heavier than ever before. The little girl's school bag seemed to be filled with stones, and each step was a struggle. The sounds of the world around her, the distant laughter of other children, the chirping of birds, the rumble of a passing car all felt muffled and far away, as if she was trapped inside a glass box of her own worry. When she reached her apartment building, she didn't go inside right away. She couldn't face her mother's hopeful questions. Instead, she sat down on the bottom step of the concrete staircase in the entryway. Pulling her knees up to her chin, she wrapped her arms around her legs and just sat there, watching a line of ants march busily along a crack in the pavement. They had a job to do, and they knew exactly how to do it. She felt a pang of envy for the tiny insects. She must have sat there for a long time, because the sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the buildings with a soft orange light. She knew she had to go in soon, or her mother would start to worry. Just then, a familiar sound drifted down from the floor above. It was the sound of a piano. But this wasn't the strict, perfect sound from Mrs. Abernathy's music room. This was different. It was a gentle, wandering melody, full of feeling. It sounded sad in some places, and a little bit hopeful in others. The notes flowed into one another like a slow, peaceful river. This was the music from the apartment next door. The man who lived there was old, with kind eyes and a head of fluffy white hair. He mostly kept to himself, but he was always friendly when they passed in the hall. Her mother had told her once that he was a retired musician. The little girl didn't know what that meant exactly, but she knew that the sounds that came from his apartment were the most beautiful sounds in the world. Listening to him play now, a tiny, fragile idea began to form in her mind. It was a crazy idea, so crazy that it almost made her laugh. But the memory of Mrs. Abernathy's cold smile in the library pushed her. Desperation made brave people out of scared children. She stood up, her legs stiff from sitting for so long. She walked slowly up the stairs, her heart starting to beat a little faster. She stood in front of his door, which was painted a faded blue. She could hear the music more clearly here. She lifted her hand, hesitated for a moment, and then knocked softly, 3 little taps. The playing stopped. There was a shuffle of footsteps, and then the door creaked open. The old man stood there, looking a little surprised. He was wearing a comfortable-looking old cardigan, even though the evening was warm. "Well, hello there, little neighbor," he said, his voice as warm and rough as an old blanket. "Is everything all right?" The little girl's courage suddenly vanished. All the words she had planned to say flew out of her head. She just stood there, looking down at her scuffed shoes. The old man didn't rush her. He just waited patiently. Finally, she managed to whisper, I have to play a song. For school. But I can't, he said, nodding slowly as if this was a very serious and important problem. "And what song is it that has you so troubled?" "It's called For Elise," she whispered. A slow smile spread across the old man's face. "A beautiful piece. But yes, it can be a tricky friend when you first meet it. Would you like to come in?" She nodded, a little shyly, and stepped inside his apartment. It was a small space, filled with books and plants and the most wonderful smell of old paper and coffee. And there, in the corner, was his piano. It wasn't fancy or grand. It was an upright piano, made of a warm, honey-colored wood, and its surface was covered in a light layer of dust. It looked friendly, like a comfortable old chair you could curl up in. He gestured for her to sit on the bench. She did, her feet dangling high above the floor. "Now," he said, sitting beside her, "show me the music." She shook her head, her eyes filling with tears again. "I can't," she confessed in a small, ashamed voice. "I can't read it. The dots and lines. They don't make any sense to me." She expected him to be disappointed, to tell her she had to learn properly. But he just chuckled, a soft, rumbling sound. "Oh, is that all? My dear child, the paper is not the music. The music is here." He tapped a finger gently over his heart. "And here." He tapped the side of his head. "The paper is just a map, and some of us," he said with a wink, "are better at finding our own way." He then placed his own hands on the keys. His fingers were old and a little bent, but when they touched the piano, they seemed to come alive. He began to play For Elise, but it wasn't the strict, note-perfect version from her sheet music. This was different. It was slower, more thoughtful. He let some notes linger a little longer, and he played others more softly. It told a story. It sounded like a memory of something beautiful and a little bit sad. The little girl listened, mesmerized. She didn't hear a list of instructions. She heard a feeling. When he finished, the room felt still and peaceful. "You see," he said, "it's just a conversation. The piano is asking a question, and you are answering. He played the first phrase again. Just for notes. Now, he said, looking at her. You tell it back to me. Hesitantly, she lifted her hand and placed her fingers on the cool, smooth keys. She closed her eyes, trying to remember the sound, not the position. She pressed down. The first note was right. Then the second. She fumbled the third, hitting a key that was too high. Almost. The old man encouraged softly. Listen again. He played it once more. She tried again. This time, the four notes came out pure and clear. A tiny spark of joy, the first she had felt in weeks, flickered inside her chest. And so, a secret routine began. Every day after school, she would go to the library and pretend to practice for a little while. Just in case Mrs. Abernathy was listening, she would make clumsy, stumbling sounds with the sheet music in front of her. But her heart wasn't in it. Her real practice began in the evenings in the warm, cluttered safety of the old man's apartment. He never once made her look at the sheet music. Instead, he would break the song down into small pieces, playing them over and over until the melody was etched into her memory. He taught her to listen for the story in the music. This part, he would say, it sounds like a secret being whispered. Or here, it's like you're remembering a happy dream. She learned to play by ear, by feeling, by the memory of sound. Her fingers learned the geography of the piano not from a map, but from the landscape of the song itself. In that small apartment, with the dusty piano and the kind old man, the music wasn't a monster to be feared. It was a friend she was learning to talk to. And for the first time, she started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had something to say. The months seemed to fly by, each day a strange mix of dread and secret joy. For the little girl, life became split into two different worlds. There was the school world. This was a world of sharp sounds and cold feelings. The click of Mrs. Abernathy's heels in the hallway was a sound that could make her freeze, no matter what she was doing. Once a week, in music class, the teacher would have her play in front of the other students. Let us hear your progress, Mrs. Abernathy would say, her voice smooth as ice. Those were the worst moments. The little girl would sit at the big, shiny piano, the intimidating sheet music for Fur-Elise propped in front of her. She would try to play from the page, her mind going blank as she tried to translate the confusing dots into movements of her fingers. The melody would come out halting and wrong, full of mistakes and long, awkward pauses. Her fingers, which felt so sure and light in the old man's apartment, turned into clumsy, frozen sticks. A few of the children would giggle behind their hands. Others would look down at their laps, feeling embarrassed for her. Mrs. Abernathy never stopped her. She would just let the painful, broken music continue until the little girl's nerves got the better of her, and she simply stopped. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. You must practice harder, the teacher would say, her tone making it clear she expected nothing less than failure. The recital is for an audience. They will not be so forgiving. Those words would echo in the girl's head for the rest of the day. They were a dark cloud hanging over her. But then, there was the other world. The world of the old man's apartment. In this world, the piano was not a monster to be conquered, but a friend to have a conversation with. The air was warm and smelled of tea and old wood. The old man was endlessly patient. He never got angry or impatient when she made a mistake. No, little one, he would say gently. Listen, the notes here are not running. They are walking together, arm in arm. Like this. He would play the phrase, and she would see it in her mind to notes walking slowly. Together. She learned to play not by memorizing which finger went where, but by understanding the feeling the music was trying to express. A run of fast notes was a sudden, happy thought. A series of low, soft chords was a quiet, sad memory. She didn't just learn to play the notes. She learned to play the story. She would sit on his bench, her small feet swinging, and play the piece from beginning to end. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes she would hesitate, searching for the next sound in her memory. But it was beautiful. It had feeling. It was her version of the song, filled with all the hope and fear and wonder she carried inside her. The old man would listen, his eyes closed, a small smile on his face. When she finished, he would simply nod and say, "You are telling the story very well." As the day of the recital drew closer, the fear from the school world began to leak into the safe world of the apartment. One evening, right after she had played the piece beautifully, she suddenly burst into tears. The old man was startled. "What is it, my dear? What's wrong?" "I can't do it," she sobbed, the words tumbling out. "I can't play in front of all those people. On that big piano. I'll forget everything. I'll be embarrassing." She cried for a long time, releasing all the fear and pressure she had been holding inside for weeks. The old man didn't try to stop her. He just handed her a soft handkerchief and waited for the storm to pass. When her sobs had quieted to little hiccups, he spoke in a soft, serious voice. "Listen to me," he said. "When you sit down at that piano, you must forget about the people. Forget about the teacher. Forget about everything." He leaned closer. "Do you see that lamp in the corner, with the yellow shade?" She nodded, sniffing. "When you are on that stage, I want you to find one light. Just one. Maybe it's a light on the ceiling, or a spotlight on the floor. You pick one light, and you pretend that you are playing just for that light. You are telling your story to that one quiet light. The people in the chairs, they are just shadows. They are not really there. You are in a room, alone, telling a beautiful story to a friendly light. Can you do that for me?" She looked at his kind, earnest face and wiped her nose with the back of her hand. She nodded slowly. It seemed like a magic trick, a way to make all the scary people disappear. The night before the recital, her parents were so excited. Her mother had laid out a special dress for her to wear. It was a simple dress, but it was her best one. Her father patted her head and said, "Our little musician. We will be in the front row, cheering the loudest." Their pride was like a heavy weight. She went to bed that night, but she couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, her heart pounding like a drum. In her mind, she could see the huge, dark auditorium and hundreds of shadowy faces, all staring at her. She could see Mrs. Abernathy's cold, expectant smile. She pulled the blanket over her head, trying to hide from the thought of tomorrow. It felt like the longest night of her life. The two worlds were about to collide, and she was terrified that the dark, scary world of school was going to swallow the beautiful, musical world of the old man whole. The day of the recital arrived. The little girl felt like she was moving through a dream. Everything seemed bright and loud. Her mother helped her into her special dress, fussing over her hair, her face beaming with pride. "You look so beautiful," she whispered, giving her a tight hug. The little girl could only manage a small, weak smile. The stone of dread in her stomach felt heavier than ever. The Oakwood Academy Auditorium was a place she had only ever seen from the back, during school assemblies. Now, from behind the heavy red curtain, it looked enormous. The lights were dim, but she could see the seats filling up with parents. They were just a sea of dark shapes, but she could hear the murmuring voices, a low, buzzing hum that filled the entire space. It was the sound of 100 conversations, 100 expectations. She peeked through a gap in the curtain and saw her parents. They were sitting right in the middle of the third row, just as her father had promised. Her mother was leaning forward, already looking toward the stage. The sight of them, so hopeful and proud, made her feel sick. Backstage, the other children were fidgeting in their nice clothes, some excited, some nervous. They were all holding their simple sheet music for their easy songs. She was the only one without any paper in her hands. Mrs. Abernathy moved among them like a strict general, straightening a boy's tie and reminding a girl to curtsy. When her eyes fell on the little girl, they held no encouragement, only a cool, distant look. It was the look of someone waiting for an inevitable disappointment. One by one, the children walked out onto the bright stage. The principal introduced each one, and the parents clapped politely. The little girl stood in the wings, her hands cold and clammy. She listened to the simple, correct tunes, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, Mary had a little lamb." Each one was played perfectly, and each one was met with warm, approving applause. Every clap felt like a hammer blow, reminding her that her turn was coming closer. Finally, the last of the other children took a bow and walked off, looking relieved. The little girl was the only one left backstage. The principal walked to the center of the stage. "And for our final performance tonight," he announced, "we have a very ambitious piece. Our next student will be playing Beethoven's For Elise. Let's have a big round of encouragement for her." The applause was polite, but it was dotted with a few murmurs. People knew this was a difficult piece for a child. Mrs. Abernathy gave her a small, firm push between her shoulder blades. "Go on," she said, her voice low. The little girl walked out onto the stage. The lights were so bright they blinded her. She could barely see the audience, just a dark, shapeless mass. Her heart was beating so fast and so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. The grand piano stood in the center of the stage, huge and black and silent. It looked like a beast waiting to pounce. She reached the piano bench. It was too high. She had to awkwardly climb onto it, her legs dangling high above the pedals. A few people in the audience chuckled softly, not to be mean, but because she looked so small and helpless. The sound of their laughter made her face burn with shame. She sat there, staring at the black and white keys. They seemed to swim in front of her eyes. Her mind went completely blank. The friendly story the old man had taught her was gone. All she could feel was the weight of hundreds of eyes staring at her. She could feel Mrs. Abernathy's stare from the side of the stage. She could feel her parents' hopeful gaze from the third row. Panic wrapped its cold fingers around her throat. She was going to fail. She was going to sit here in this terrible silence and then run off the stage crying. It was all going to happen just as the teacher had planned. But then, through the fog of her fear, she remembered the old man's words. Find one light. Her eyes, wide with fright, scanned the blinding brightness. She looked past the dark void of the audience, past the shiny wood of the piano. Then, she saw it. A single, small spotlight was shining onto the floor near the front of the stage, creating a perfect, bright circle. You are telling your story to that one quiet light. She took a deep, shaky breath. She closed her eyes for a second, blocking out everything else. When she opened them, she fixed her gaze on that one circle of light on the floor. The dark shapes in the seats became blurry, unimportant shadows. The buzzing in her ears faded away. She lifted her hands, and then she began to play. But it wasn't the stiff, broken version from the music room. It was the story from the old man's apartment. The first notes came out, not timid and unsure, but gentle and thoughtful. She wasn't just pressing keys. She was having a conversation. The piano was asking a question, and she was answering. Her fingers, which had been so clumsy under pressure, now moved with a memory of their own. They remembered the feeling, not the fear. The melody unfolded not like a robot reading a list, but like a real person telling a tale. She played the sad parts with a soft tenderness, letting the notes linger. She played the faster, flowing parts with a quiet confidence, her small hands moving with a grace no one knew she possessed. She put all of her loneliness, all of her secret joy in the old man's apartment, all of her quiet hope into the music. It was her story, told through the keys. The audience was utterly still. The polite, expectant smiles had vanished from their faces, replaced by looks of genuine surprise and then deep captivation. You could have heard a pin drop in the vast room. The only sound was the beautiful, heartfelt music flowing from the small child and the giant piano. In the third row, her mother's hand slowly crept to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears of stunned pride. Her father sat up straighter, his chest swelling at the side of the stage. Mrs. Abernathy stood frozen. Her arms, which had been crossed, fell limply to her sides. The cold, satisfied look on her face had melted away, replaced by pure, uncomprehending shock. She was listening to a performance filled with more emotion and understanding than she had ever managed to teach anyone. The little girl played on, lost in her conversation with the light on the floor. She played the final, haunting notes, letting them fade slowly into a perfect, breathless silence. For a moment, nothing happened. The audience was too stunned to move. Then one person in the back began to clap. Then another. And then, as if a spell had been broken, the entire auditorium erupted. The sound was not polite applause. It was thunderous, joyful, and roaring. People were getting to their feet, their faces filled with awe and admiration. The noise startled the little girl. She blinked, coming back to herself. She looked out at the sea of people, all standing and clapping for her. She saw her mother and father, both on their feet, clapping harder than anyone, their faces wet with tears of joy. She slowly slid off the bench, remembering what the other children had done. She gave a small, shy bow as she walked off the stage, the applause still washing over her. She passed Mrs. Abernathy. The teacher looked at her, and for the first time, there was no coldness, no judgment in her eyes. There was only a look of quiet, humbled respect. She gave the little girl a single, slow nod. The little girl didn't smile. She just walked past, back to her waiting parents. The monster had been tamed not by following a map, but by listening to her own heart. And in the silence that had once judged her, she had found her own, powerful voice.